to today's webinar. It looks like we've got some people joining us, so we'll give it a few more seconds as more people are logging on to today's webinar. We're really excited to launch our second of 4 leadership sessions for our Princess K virtual leadership sessions. So thank you for taking an hour out of your day to join us this afternoon. Before we begin, I just want to introduce our speaker and let you know that today we have Amber Pankinen, who is a registered dietitian, joining us, and she'll be providing us with a talk on nutrition myth busting as well as communication strategies, plus a fun food demonstration at the end. And so everyone knows that this is a recording. She had a conflict right away, but she will be joining us live at the end of today's webinar for some virtual interactions and answering questions that anybody has. So with that, if you do have questions or comments, please remember to utilize that question and answer box as well as the chat box at the bottom of your screen, especially as we roll into that Q&A portion. So without any further ado, we will hit play. And again, I hope you enjoy today's presentation from our esteemed guest, Amber Pankinen.
Okay, I think that this is recording, so we will get started. Hello, Dairy Princesses. It is such an honor to be with you today. My name is Amber Pankinen. I'm a registered dietitian and personal chef located in Lincoln, Nebraska. I work as a recipe developer, and I'm a full-time teaching instructor at Great Plains Culinary Institute, located in Lincoln, Nebraska at Southeast Community College. In fact, as you're watching this, you're aware that this is not live. I'm actually recording today's session because I'm currently in class right now. But don't worry, at the end of this, I will be joining you live for Q&A to answer any questions that you might have. So just a little background about this. When I was talking to Janet about your group and what would be most valuable for you, she thought about having me address maybe some different nutrition myths that are out there about dairy, and then also maybe give you some communication strategies, and then wrap it all up with a fun food demo at the end. So we have a lot to go through today. So I hope this will be helpful for you in your conversations with your friends and people that you talk to out in public when they ask you about dairy, that hopefully this will give you a little more confidence in moving forward. So what I would like to do is just share with you a little bit about my background. So I call this my dairy story. We'll talk about some of those top nutrition myths that I hear specifically as a registered dietitian. We'll address a few communication strategies, and then I'll wrap it up with that recipe demo. So again, my name is Amber. You can find me on social media on Twitter and Instagram at rdamber. If you're on Facebook, you can find me personally, but my brand is Stirlist. So I do run a recipe site, stirlist.com. And like I said, I'm teaching at Great Plains Culinary Institute, and I've been working with Midwest Dairy since the year, I think it's been since 2013 as an ambassador or partner in some way, either developing recipes or doing different TV spots here in Lincoln. So I've had a great relationship with Midwest Dairy throughout the years. So I wanted to share with you just a little bit about myself and why I love dairy so much. So this is actually a photo of my siblings and I. So I'm the youngest of 4 kids, and I did grow up here in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is a fairly small community, but my grandparents farmed in Falls City, Nebraska, which is about 2 hours away from here. And honestly, I don't remember the farm. I was much too young for that by the time that they had sold it and they had moved to another city. But I think that experience with them, especially as, my grandparents were farmers, and then, my dad working on the farm, really instilled a lot of good values, especially for me growing up. And I'll never forget those conversations around the dinner table when I was younger, when most kids were being told to eat what was on their plate because of starving children in the world. I was being told to eat what was on my plate because a farmer had worked really hard to produce that or make that food possible. And so I think that just really inspired a lot of the conversations that I'm having today as a registered dietitian. So I wanted to give you just a little background about what registered dietitians do and who we are, because chances are you may be thinking about going into the field of nutrition. So just wanted to give you a little encouragement here. So registered dietitians, they've completed a bachelor's degree, and now the trend is for most registered dietitians to have their master's degree. And actually moving forward, registered dietitians will be required to have a master's degree. So we have passed the national examination. We've, I have also completed an internship experience in order to be able to sit for that registration exam. And then we can, also we complete continuing education every single year. And so it would be similar to maybe a training like this, where you're coming and you're learning about nutrition, you're learning about dairy's role in nutrition. In fact, I just gave a talk to my colleagues last month for continuing education about dairy. So we're required to keep up on our education. Registered dietitians are employed in a number of different ways. We've got dietitians who are working for schools, clinical dietitians who work for hospitals and clinics. You might see a dietitian in private practice who is seeing folks for maybe weight management, weight loss, potentially eating disorders. And then we also see dietitians who are working in marketing and PR. So for example, there are dietitians who work for Midwest Dairy as well, who help with outreach and communications. My role as a registered dietitian is a little different. I started out as a clinical RD. Early in my career, I worked as a clinical dietitian for about 3 years. So I was calculating nutrient needs for patients who were on tube feedings. And, I appreciated my job, but I knew that was definitely not what I wanted to do long term. So I had quit my job in 2012. And shortly after, I had been invited to a dairy tour by Midwest Dairy. So at the time, Stephanie Cundiff, which some of you may know her name. I know she's not with Midwest Dairy anymore, but at the time, she was really the person who drew me in terms of just introducing me to dairy's story. So again, back in 2013, I took this tour, and this is actually a photo from that very tour. This is actually the Heinz family farm. So Chris Heinz, who is located in Missouri, we went and we toured his farm. And this was the first time that I had been on a dairy farm that I can remember since I was little. I remember going to some local dairies when I was in elementary school, but as an adult, I hadn't had that experience for a very long time. And this was really eye-opening to me because, we got to meet Chris, who is, I believe, a 6th-generation dairy farmer. And you could just see the passion that he had for dairy and for his farm, and especially that family legacy, which I really hadn't thought about much before. And what's really funny too about Chris is at the time, and Janet knows Chris too, at the time, he was a single dude. And so there's all of these married women who are trying to mother him and trying to set him up with different women that they had in mind. But what's really funny about this story is the following year, and Janet knows this too, his wife actually tells us that she credits us who were on that tour with the fact that she actually took a date with him because they met online. She apparently went back and stalked him a little bit and found, our blogs, our tweets, our messages on social media about visiting his farm. And so just kind of a cool story in terms of us being able to share about that and then how they got together. And now I think they have like 4 or 5 kids. So it was a happy ending. But, he was definitely just super helpful in sharing Dairy's story with a group of registered dietitians who then went out and blogged and shared about it on social media. So it really definitely had an impact on me. And so shortly after that, I actually started stirless.com, which is my recipe blog and site, to just inspire kitchen confidence and to stir up that kitchen confidence. Because it can be hard to get in the kitchen, especially if you're not super familiar, if you didn't grow up cooking with parents or a caregiver, that can be really overwhelming and intimidating. So the recipes that I have on my website are, I have a lot of dairy inspired recipes, but also recipes that are just super easy to create. And then when I'm also incorporating or doing other recipes, I love to incorporate dairy because one, the flavor cannot be beat, but also because of the nutrition. So what I wanted to do is just address, some of the nutrition dairy myths that, I'm seeing as a registered dietitian, that some of my colleagues are also seeing. And as I mentioned earlier, I gave a presentation last month to my colleagues through the Nebraska Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics about dairy nutrition myths. And so these slides were actually provided by National Dairy Council. So I just want to give a shout out and credit to them for the slides that I'm going to use here for the next couple of minutes. And what I wanted to do is just address really these first three myths with you, because I think myths 4 and 5, you're well familiar with these. And so when I was talking to the group of registered dietitians, they're not as familiar, with dairy as you are. So we won't be really diving into those. But the first three, I think, might be really helpful for you in terms of talking to your friends or talking to consumers about dairy. So a little background about these slides and that presentation. So back in 2017 to, I think it was maybe early 2019, National Dairy Council had surveyed a group of health and fitness professionals about the questions that they were receiving about dairy. And they assessed that basically, yes, these were the top myths or the top questions that they were getting in relation to dairy. So again, you all know this, right? But I think it's important to ground ourselves that when we're talking about dairy foods, of course, we know that it's more than just milk, but all dairy foods start with milk, right? So of course, cheese, yogurt, ice cream, sour cream, cottage cheese. So this first myth, right? The myth is that dairy foods are easily replaceable. And, we know that in fact, no, it's really hard to replace nutrition that is actually in dairy foods. So milk has a very unique nutrient profile that's tough to match. So it's nutrient rich with just 3, simple ingredients: milk, vitamins A, and vitamin D. So it also provides 9 essential nutrients. It contains high quality protein and no added sugar. In fact, it is the #1 food source of 3 of the 4 underconsumed nutrients of public health concern that's identified by the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So calcium, vitamin D, and potassium. So in addition to protein and those nutrients that you're seeing right there, you get really more bang for the nutritional buck with milk, including phosphorus, vitamins A, D, B2, B3, which is niacin, and B5, which is pantothenic acid, and B12. We also know that nutrient-rich milk is the primary ingredient for yogurt, which provides 7 nutrients, and then for cheese, which provides 6 nutrients per serving. And occasionally, you might hear that, you can replace calcium in milk with other foods like leafy greens and dairy alternatives. I know I hear this quite a bit, especially from the media. But the reality is that dairy foods provide a very unique nutrient package that is difficult to replace. So in fact, the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee noted that the potential challenges of meeting nutrient needs within caloric limits when eliminating dairy foods, it's tough. So just looking at calcium, for example, and this is one of my favorite visuals, you'd have to eat about 17 cups of raw kale to get the equivalent amount of calcium in 3 8-ounce glasses of milk. 17 cups, which is crazy, right? I don't know anyone who likes to eat even a cup of kale, let alone 17 cups of kale. But this is not just about calcium, it's about total nutrient package. So remember, milk provides the 9 essential nutrients in just 1 8-ounce cup of milk, right? It's also very affordable and it's accessible. So in fact, for about $1 a day, people can get 3 servings of dairy as recommended in the healthy US style eating pattern. And I think just as an additional reminder here, that the dietary guidelines for Americans recommends 3 servings of low fat or fat-free dairy foods per day. And I know I also get a lot of questions about protein in dairy and the different types of high quality protein, and why is dairy considered high quality? So I think we need to just break down these terms here. So dairy foods combine 2 types of high quality protein. So we've got whey and we've got casein. So approximately 80% of the protein in milk is casein protein, while the other 20% is whey protein. So both whey and casein are high quality. They're complete proteins, meaning they provide all 9 essential amino acids. However, there are subtle differences in amino acid composition and the rate of digestion, which might impact how and when you decide to use them. So whey protein in milk is often referred to as the fast protein due to its more rapid, more transient release of amino acids to the muscle. So given that it's one of the most concentrated sources of leucine, which also promotes muscle protein synthesis, and again, about 2.5 grams per leucine are provided per 20 grams of protein. So along with its rapid digestibility, some experts have noted that whey is really the protein of choice right after a tough workout. Where casein, again, which is also found in milk, is referred to more of that slow protein because of its slower digestive rate. So, these proteins can be removed from milk. They can be dried into a powder and used as an ingredient as a high quality protein supplement, right? So you may have seen that marketed, right, in some beverages or even some foods. And I can tell you too, as a personal chef and instructor, we're teaching students how they can add certain proteins to food. Again, the whey protein to food. So whether that's in beverages, we're experimenting with certain baked dishes right now as well. Again, because we know that consumers are looking for high quality protein. We know that whey is one of the more affordable sources of high quality protein. So again, it's just a good bang for your buck there. So what exactly do we mean when we say high quality protein? Again, I'll just quickly go through that. So high quality proteins are those that provide all of the essential amino acids that the body needs to function properly. So foods vary in their protein quality, as not all protein, right, are equivalent sources of essential amino acids. So we know that whey protein, which is a high quality protein found in milk, is one of the best sources of essential amino acids relative to the amount of calories that it provides. Again, it also provides leucine, which can assist with that protein synthesis. It acts as a dietary trigger to really support that anabolic response in the muscle tissue. So in other words, it helps to repair and rebuild muscle. So some experts recommend eating about 20 to 30 grams of high quality protein at each meal. And that can help you to, again, help support with weight management. It can help support an active lifestyle and also help support that healthy aging process. So something to consider too, the new dietary guidelines actually just came out a few months ago. They were a little late to be released because of COVID, but the 2020 dietary guidelines actually even states that healthy eating patterns, which include low fat or fat-free dairy foods, are associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and other types of cancer. So again, we've seen dairy's unique nutritional benefits acknowledged in the last 4 sets of the dietary guidelines. And this is something too that's really interesting to me as a registered dietitian, because we hear all the time that folks are not getting enough fruits and vegetables, right? Again, we know that that's important, that folks get their fruits and vegetables. But look at this, right? When you see nearly 9 in 10 Americans fall short on dairy recommendations. So as you can see in the blue box, Americans consume on average less than 2-cup equivalents of dairy foods per day. So adding just one more serving of dairy a day could help people meet the recommendations. It could close those shortfall nutrient gaps and support health benefits. And again, too, I think what's interesting to remember is, if you're an athlete right now, or if you're really, really active, I like to remind folks that whether it's white or chocolate milk, that milk is a wholesome, nutrient-rich foods that provides many of the key nutrients that athletes need in order to support recovery and performance. So in a few weeks here, I'll be running the Lincoln Half Marathon. I think it's my 3rd or 4th time running the half marathon. And one of my favorite things to do when I cross that finish line is drink my chocolate milk because it just tastes so good. And I feel good about drinking that, again, because I know it's providing me with that high quality protein to help rebuild and repair muscle. But then it also provides me with the fluid and the electrolytes I needed to replenish what has been lost. So something else that's interesting too, and again, I'm happy to share some of these slides later on, but just to see here, how we get protein from different foods, right? So if you think about the protein in dairy versus some of the other protein foods, and especially for athletes, athletes actually need a little bit higher amount of protein, right? Compared to maybe, folks who are not as active. So again, I can share this with you later on, but the takeaway from this slide is that athletes just need a little more protein. All right, the second myth is that dairy foods are not needed for health. And, we've seen this message that has been shared by a lot of those plant-based organizations or groups that are really promoting vegan diets or even vegetarian diets. And, the research would disagree with this, right? So again, we have, that again, looking at the dietary guidelines, right? And especially the 2005, 2010, 2015, and then, the 2020 guidelines, they've done reviews and basically concluded that dairy foods provide numerous health benefits, including lowering the risk of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. So what I'm going to do is just walk through a few slides here. And again, I'll point you in the direction of the National Dairy Council as well for the specific research. But there are a multitude of studies that have addressed these concerns. So again, we've seen a large and growing body of evidence that has shown that the consumption of dairy foods, including whole milk, reduced fat milk, low-fat milk, and fat-free cheese and yogurt have either a neutral or beneficial association with risk for several chronic diseases. So again, the consumption of dairy foods either have a neutral or beneficial link to lowering risk of cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, and type 2 diabetes. So this slide right here, this really kind of sums up the next few slides. Again, because you might have heard that, dairy is not good for heart disease, or dairy is not good for high blood pressure, or dairy can be harmful for type 2 diabetes. Again, if you dive into the literature and you break down those studies, they would say otherwise. So with CVD, which is cardiovascular disease, basically what they found in looking at these studies is that total dairy and cheese consumption, right, is associated with lower risk for stroke. Total dairy, cheese, yogurt consumption is not associated with higher risk for CVD, and total dairy, cheese, and yogurt consumption is not associated with higher risk for coronary artery disease. So that's great news. When it comes to high blood pressure, so again, high blood pressure or hypertension is when your blood pressure is elevated. So, right now, looking at the United States, 2/3 of Americans either have high blood pressure or they have pre-hypertension. So this is a real concern, especially when we know that high blood pressure puts you at disease risk for heart disease and stroke. So looking specifically at dairy's role in high blood pressure, it was found that Dairy is associated with lower risk for hypertension. It is not associated with higher risk for hypertension. And then there's additional trials that are taking place right now to basically assess or investigate how dairy products may contribute to a healthy blood pressure in different populations. And so when I look at dairy foods and blood pressure's role, we've got calcium, we've got potassium, which play a very important role in blood pressure. And we know that dairy provides both. With type 2 diabetes, we saw that total dairy, yogurt, and cheese consumption is associated with lower risk for type 2 diabetes. And then a meta-analysis, which means basically looking at a group of studies, found that eating approximately 3 ounces of yogurt per day compared to none is associated with a lower risk for type 2 diabetes. So really cool stuff, a lot of cool data here when it comes to showing dairy's role, again, right, and potentially lowering the risk of these diseases. So as we move forward, I just want to, again, point to nationaldairycouncil.org. You can find all of these studies that were mentioned on that previous slide at that website. And then looking at, other nutrients like calcium and vitamin D, we know that dairy provides a good amount of calcium, vitamin D, and protein. So I like this just from the perspective that you can see, with calcium, a sports dietitian might recommend up to 13 milligrams per day. Again, one serving of dairy food provides 300 milligrams. So the third myth is related to lactose intolerance and dairy avoidance. So, just because somebody is lactose intolerant does not mean that they have to completely avoid dairy. So what I wanted to do is basically just break down the difference between lactose intolerance and a milk allergy, because there might be some confusion there. So lactose intolerance, this is characterized by a number of symptoms, which could include abdominal pain, bloating, flatulence, maybe diarrhea. And this may happen after some people eat or drink dairy. And really, this happens because folks who have lactose intolerance essentially are lacking an enzyme that helps break down lactose in the body. So again, if you have lactose intolerance, it's important to make sure that your symptoms are not from another problem. So you'll want to make sure that folks are getting assistance from a doctor to diagnose that and not just self-diagnosing. Versus a milk allergy, right? We know that this is a reaction to the milk protein like casein, and it's triggered by the immune system. We do see that it can be outgrown, especially if you're seeing it happen in kids. Actually, the research is showing that you can outgrow that as those kids grow older. However, with the milk allergy, we know that they should avoid milk and milk products unless that allergy is outgrown. So there is a very unique difference between the two. Again, one is the reaction, right, to that protein. It's triggered by the immune system, where one is basically occurring because lack of an enzyme to help break down that milk sugar. So again, there's a number of resources at nationaldairycouncil.org when it comes to looking at dairy or lactose intolerance. So I just want you to be aware that that's there. But really the takeaway, I think, from this myth would be this slide right here. And that's just to see the number of ways that you can still include dairy in your diet if you are lactose intolerant. So we know that lactose intolerance, this is a very individualized condition because it impacts everyone differently. And the amount of lactose that can be tolerated as well can be different for each person. So really, I think, if you have lactose intolerance, you have to understand what type of dairy foods impact you, because there are some tips and tricks here in order to help minimize the lactose. So you can get lactose-free milk, right, which is a great option. You can sip it, you can stir it, you can slice it, shred it, or spoon it. So it's kind of fun to say, 20 times fast. But starting small, right, and then introducing dairy slowly. You can stir it, so mixing milk with other foods, again, to help slow digestion, that can help. You can slice it, so again, in the form of cheese, especially more of those natural cheeses versus some of the aged cheeses. So like cheddar and Swiss, you can shred it and then spooning it. So again, yogurt, right, including yogurts, live cultures, can also help digest lactose. So I know that was a lot of information and just a very quick amount of time. But what I wanted to do with some of the remainder of the time that we have, briefly, I just want to talk about a couple communication strategies. So I know you're getting asked about these things, and especially these top 3 myths, when it comes to dairy foods being easily replaceable, if you're lactose intolerant, you can't have dairy. So how do you address that, right? How do you talk to people about that? And especially, I know if you're not the nutrition expert, that can be really tough. So a couple things that I like to do when I'm either giving a talk to somebody, or if I'm having a conversation, or even when I'm making a social media post. These are questions that I would ask myself in making certain posts, or again, kind of planning to have that conversation with somebody. Number one, consider who your audience is, right? So are you talking to your friends who maybe have just watched a documentary? Are you talking to maybe an older adult who maybe they're getting information from somewhere else? So it's important to consider who your audience is. Second, I would ask, what do you want them to know, right? So do you want them to know that dairy provides all 9 essential amino acids? Okay, so think about that. Why do you want them to know it? Well, because again, that's a very convenient source of protein, right? It's affordable and it's accessible and it's local, right? That's why you want them to know that. And then questions 4 and 5, what do you want them to do with the information that you just shared with them? And why do you want them to do it? So for me, what do you want them to do? Maybe I want them to share the post that I just made about milk containing all 9 essential amino acids, right? And that it's a convenient and delicious source of high quality protein. Can you share that post for me? Why do you want them to share that? Again, we want to share dairy story, right? So going back to those 5 questions, number 1, think about who your audience is. What do you want them to know? Why do you want them to know it? What do you want them to do? And why do you want them to do it? Other questions that I get about, communicating dairy story, or even when I'm on social media, is, students will come to me all the time and ask, well, what do I post? Where do I post? When do I post? How much do I post? So maybe you're in that boat too. Maybe some of these questions are kind of going through your mind too. So let's just walk through a few things that I want you to think about. So what platforms are your favorite? And I know that this is kind of an old slide, but what platforms are your favorite? Where do you spend your time on? And specifically, the audience that you're trying to communicate, where are they hanging out at, right? Where do you want to be? I know the one I don't have on here is TikTok. And of course, I've got my husband in the background who's listening to me here. How comfortable are you talking about dairy story? Are you kind of a keyboard warrior like this, or are you like this, right? You kind of tend to freak out. I promise it gets better over time. So the more you practice it, I think the more confident you will become. Using hashtags, I think, are great too, in terms of just trying to connect with different folks, or maybe even some of those folks who are spreading misinformation about dairy. You can use hashtags to do that, and finding others that way too, I think, can be really helpful. This one here, I know this is kind of funny, but who do you admire, right? When you're looking at social media right now in terms of sharing dairy story, who do you admire? I just put the Pioneer Woman up here because my sister is obsessed with her. So I put a picture of her here, but she does a great job of telling the story where she's at, being on a ranch in Oklahoma. She's a marketer. She gets it. So I would say, find that platform that fits your time and your talents. These are very old screenshots, but here's Adrienne Hines from years ago. Again, she's talked about how, Instagram was one of her favorite platforms back in the day. Here's Janet, right? Janet always did a great job with Twitter and still continues to do an awesome job. Janet, I apologize. No, this tweet is like from 4 years ago, but it's still a good one, right? In terms of her just sharing that story and showing, what's happening on her farm. So again, consider where your people are hanging out, right? Who do you want to connect with? So again, try to assess, what social media platforms they're on. Are they on Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, Facebook? Where are they at? Keeping imagery consistent across platforms, I think, can be really powerful as you're kind of building that personal brand for yourself. I think that can be really important. Again, this is an old photo. This is Adrian, her husband, again, Chris. But Adrian always did a great job and still does a great job of just keeping that imagery very consistent. And I think she even has these images too, or something similar now on her Instagram highlights, again, which is really fun to see how she has taken that brand and been able to tell Dairy's story with it. So a couple more of these, what do people like to see you post about? I know for me, it's kind of a mix. People like to see me talk about nutrition myths on my social media. They also like to see photos of my dogs. So again, I think it's important to make sure you're sharing that meaningful and shareable content as well when you're strategizing. So here's another dietitian colleague of mine. She talked about Dairy's story here a couple of years ago. But again, all of these are Ds who've taken it on themselves to try and share Dairy's story, I think is pretty cool. A couple other thoughts, right? How do you want people to feel when they're interacting with your posts? I think that's something to consider. And then, of course, take part in the conversation. So that's really it in terms of, just a few brief communication strategies. I know that was quick. Maybe in the future, we can get back together and I can break those down a little bit quicker. But I did want to save some time today so that we can talk about preparing dairy. So I have a recipe demo for you. We're going to make Parmesan and pomegranate butternut squash noodles. And you can find the recipe at midwestdairy.com. And so I'm just going to take 1 second here to transition. We'll get some cameras flipped here, and then we'll start the recipe demo. And I also have my husband here joining me today too. So you'll get to meet him. All right, Ben, do you want to go ahead and switch cameras? All right, go for it. Okay, so it looks like we've got our camera switch here. I'm just going to move my monitor over so that you can see this a little easier. Also need to make sure I'm watching my timer here. Ben, you can come over here.
Well, welcome. Yeah, it's fun to be with the Dairy Princesses.
Right?
Do we want to stop sharing maybe our PowerPoint?
Oh, sure.
And then we can just share. That way we're not so tiny.
There we go. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, that
Great.
works. Okay. So we're still figuring out the cameras. And of course, because we're recording this, we know that this can be a little goofy, but we've got a couple minutes left. So I did want to show you this recipe. Again, you can find this at midwestdairy.com. And I liked this because I think just with the time of year, we want to encourage folks to eat fruits and vegetables, but this is a great way to get dairy into your diet. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and start by warming our pan. And I'm going to add about a tablespoon of olive oil to the pan here. And we'll let that warm up and get nice and warm. So I know Ben has some mixed feelings about butternut squash.
I did have a bad experience once, but overall, I've had some good butternut squash soup.
Yeah.
Also,
but
a
one
little
time,
brown sugar.
I was going to say, yeah, one time though, he had butternut squash soup and he hated
It's
it.
true.
He did not like it. So we're just going to turn this up a little bit.
What else do we have here?
Well, we have our butternut squash, which actually, and I wanted to show you, I actually got the frozen version of this.
Okay, so we're taking the easy route.
This is a little bit of a shortcut.
Uh-huh.
So these are already ready to go. These are the veggie spirals that you can get in the freezer section. You could also utilize, you want to hand that to me?
Sure.
So this is raw butternut squash, and I've already cut this up. If you're going to use the raw butternut squash, before you cut into it, please do me a favor, stick it in the microwave for 1 minute, because that will help soften it and that will help your knife go through it a little bit easier. Okay. We ready for the overhead? There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
I kind of want to see, what all of you have going on.
So we've warmed our oil, and I'm going to go ahead and add 12 12 ounces of the butternut squash to our pan here. And basically, we're just going to saute this a little bit and kind of mix it around here. Now right here, it's sizzling.
How will you know when it's done?
Well, I'm going to look for maybe just a slight bit of browning and caramelization on it, but it's going to take a couple minutes. So
Okay.
this is, again, raw butternut squash. And if you did take a shortcut like I did by getting it in the freezer section in your microwave, what you'll want to do is not cook it for the full time that it's been recommended on that package. I only put it in the microwave for about 3 minutes, removed it, and then I tried to get some of the water out of it as well, just so that it's not super watery in the pan here. So yeah, you just cook it with the olive oil until it starts to kind of brown and caramelize there for us. But we're also going to be adding here briefly some butter, some sage, and then we're going to use pomegranate and Parmesan. And the recipe on Midwest Dairy calls for pumpkin seeds, but we are actually going to use pistachios because I like pistachios better. So
All
just
right.
a personal preference here. Okay, so this is starting to cook up a little bit. This might take a few minutes. So again, be patient with it. It's already starting to smell really good. You smell that?
Yeah.
It smells pretty good.
Well, we've got great colors here.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that I like about, so butternut squash, again, you're getting vitamin A in here as well. This is actually what we call a carotenoid form of vitamin A. So this is not the active form of vitamin A, but it's still a good source of vitamin A. And then when we add our pomegranate, we're also going to be getting later on some fiber and potassium, which you can find in pomegranate seeds. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. I think just for the sake of time, what I'd like to do is add, I'm going to do a tablespoon of butter. And the recipe calls for removing the squash from the pan, but you don't have to do that. You could just go ahead and add your butter in here. Oh, smells so good. So I'm going to melt this butter. We're going to, yeah, just get it nice and coated here. And turn that down just a little bit. Ben's excited because he gets to eat this later.
I am excited. Food demos are the best.
Yeah, they are.
So at the end of this, as we're kind of putting all of this together, what you're kind of aiming for in a recipe like this isn't just sort of like one flavor profile, right? Like you've got multiple different types of things going in here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then crunch, right? Like we're gonna have texture. Is a big thing. I know we talk about sometimes.
We eat with our eyes.
Mhm.
We eat with our eyes. Okay, so I have our butter in here. Next, I'm going to add a tablespoon of fresh sage, and we're going to mix this all around, and that looks so good. So a little trick, if you are cooking at home with seasonings, so if you're using fresh versus dried, here's what you need to know. There is a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you see a recipe and it calls for 3 teaspoons of fresh sage, you would only use 1 teaspoon of dried sage. So like I said, I used fresh today, but maybe you're at home and you don't have fresh sage. You just have it, the dried form in your cupboard. You can use that, just don't use as much. Otherwise it's gonna be really, really powerful.
And is that because it's blended more? Like it's just a finer ingredient?
It's just more concentrated, right? It's just more concentrated. Okay, so next I'm going to add our pistachios in here. We're just going to stir this around just very quickly. It's already starting to look really good.
Yeah, well, it's smelling really, really
I'm
good.
going to turn off the heat. I'm going to keep it in here and we're going to spin this around just a little bit. And then we'll add this pomegranate. Oh,
Pomegranate
yeah.
is probably one of my favorite fruits.
I love pomegranate.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And then our MVP really in this dish is the Parmesan. So I haven't added a lot of other seasonings to this. You could add a little bit of salt, But just keep in mind that Parmesan is going to have so much flavor and provide, I think, again, just so much flavor to this that you're not really going to need to add much more. So Ben, I'm going to have you hold this.
All right.
I'm going to go ahead and just turn this off for a second. We're going to plate this up. That looks really, really good. And this recipe says that it serves two. So you could certainly, I would serve this as a side, quite honestly, because I could eat this whole thing. I think one person could eat this whole thing pretty easily. So this would be really more of a side dish.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's get our stuff out here. Doesn't that look so pretty?
It looks really good.
Yeah.
Like this is like a full meal now,
Yeah,
right? Like,
so good. And then I'm just gonna like basically top it with this Parmesan cheese. So good. Yeah.
awesome.
And then you can kind of stir it up in here. And we're having this on a plate, but it would look really nice too in a bowl. So yeah. And then if you wanted to add like, again, some fresh greens in there, be super easy just to get a little parsley and shred that on the top. And just a couple of tips here. Ben, maybe you want to go ahead and switch cameras.
Sure.
I don't have, can you grab my chef's knife over there? I'm going to show you just really quickly when you are handling a knife, because this is good life skills here for you. Okay, so here's a chef's knife for you. So when you're holding the chef's knife, please, if you're doing any type of recipe demo or something, or you're on camera or you're taking a photo, please hold the knife correctly. So make sure you got a good grip on it, okay? Don't just hold it up here. Make sure you got a good handle on that, because that will allow you to have proper control of that knife. So I'm just going to cut a little bit of parsley here. We're going to top that, and voila. I don't know if you can see that on the GoPro here, but that's our food. So yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope that this was educational for you. I hope you learned something, and thank you, Ben, for
I'm excited to eat this right
he gets
now.
to eat it with me. So yeah. Again, thank you. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at rdamber, and I hope to connect with you there. So again, I think we're going to be switching so that I can take questions at this time. So thanks, everyone.
All right. And we are glad that Amber is done with teaching her class, so she's able to join us. So everyone, welcome, Amber. Hello. We're excited you are here. So first of all, I have a really burning question. And how did that taste? Because, I mean, we're over the lunch hour now, and that definitely made me a bit hungry.
It tasted so good. I mean, I just love the combination of sweet and salty, and especially the texture. So, you know, the texture of the butternut squash being a little softer with pistachios in there. And then, of course, the cheese just made it all come together.
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, I'm a little bit hungry now, and it did look really beautiful. So I think that was a really fun opportunity for everyone who was on the line and who will listen to this recording later. Hopefully they're inspired to try something new, because I think when we do pair dairy with some fruits and vegetables like that, what an awesome and nutritious meal for everyone. Just a reminder to everyone on the line today that's listening in, use that Q&A box or that chat box since we've got Amber here to ask some questions. And I know someone already submitted a question, and they say, you mentioned the ratio for using fresh versus dry spices. Are recipes typically written for dry ingredients unless stated as fresh?
It really just depends on who's writing their recipe and where it's coming from. I mean, in a perfect world, right, it would always say fresh or dried. So you kind of have to use your best judgment there. I think, when I look at recipes, especially like on Midwest Dairy, I think they do a pretty good job of indicating which one you're supposed to use. But again, it's not a perfect world, so we have imperfect recipes. That's okay.
So speaking of recipes, I did a little bit of investigating on your website, and it looks so much fun, and I love it. The stir list, what a great marketing strategy behind that. But what's some of your favorite parts of creating recipes, and what are some of your favorite kind of food groups and favorite ingredients to use when you are creating something new?
I will say I absolutely love cooking with dairy, and I know we're talking about dairy today, but it's no lie. I mean, that's why I work with Midwest Dairy, because I love using dairy. And I'll tell you something too. I didn't share this, I think, during our recording, but I went back to culinary school 2 years ago. And when we are trained as registered dietitians, we are taught that, you should reduce fat, cook with minimal fat, which is, I think recommended, but gosh, going back to culinary school, I fell in love with full fat dairy again. So cooking with butter, cooking with whole milk, again, because of the flavor aspect of it. And I think this is something that sometimes we miss in cooking, because dairy adds so much flavor, and that full fat can add so much flavor. Then you don't have to consume as much in the end, and you'll feel so much more satisfied. So I love utilizing dairy in my dishes, and when I'm creating, it's really what inspires me at the time. So movies, music, books. I love watching a movie or reading something and then trying to maybe come up with a dish that has something to do with that. That's the nerd inside of me. So when it comes to inspiration.
I love that, because I was going to ask you what inspires some of your dishes. So I think it's fun, really kind of, whatever moves you, so to speak. So very fun, very fun. I think going back to some of the social media aspect, next week we're actually going to dive deeper into how we connect with consumers. But I think you brought up a good point, because it is something that is so important. And what do you find is one of the challenges of communicating the positive story that dairy has, and how have you overcome that challenge?
I think, one of the challenges out there is all of the misinformation that's out there. So especially documentaries, different posts on social media, and not just, maybe coming from organizations or groups, but just individual posts that people will make. I think that's been a huge challenge, in addressing those myths. But I try to point people back to the science, right? And just redirect them. There's, again, encouraging folks to kind of dive a little bit deeper into okay, who's actually writing that post? Who are the experts behind that post? And trying to figure out who's actually sponsoring that information, I think can be really helpful.
And then maybe when you connect with them, what resources are you using to help them if you've opened that conversation and there's a path forward? I think we realize that some conversations are probably never going to happen, and that's okay sometimes. But when there's an opportunity there to forge a relationship and connect and bring them some value, what resources are you providing back to that person who is a little confused?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, Jenna, because we call that that 10% who's on one side, the 10% who's on the other. It's really more focusing on that movable middle, right? Yeah, exactly. And trying to redirect them. As far as resources, of course, Midwest Dairy is a great resource. However, I think the best resource is actually the dairy farmer themselves. So I've had students in my classroom who've asked about dairy. They've asked different questions about what happens on the farm. And thank goodness, I have folks like Janet. I have folks here in Nebraska. No, seriously, I have folks here in Nebraska that I can essentially turn to and say, would you help answer this question? Because I'm not totally sure how to answer it. And they're the best resource, in what's happening on their farm. And so, yeah, again, farmers are the best resource. So I always point to them first. And then I can give them sites like Midwest Dairy, or of course, there's National Dairy and DMI, which provides some great science.
That's great to hear. And absolutely, I want to reiterate that we as Midwest Dairy are definitely here to help connect that and that conversation, point people in the right direction. And I see we've gotten a couple questions in the Q&A. And let's go to the first one. Midwest Dairy has many recipes, but where else can we find dairy recipes to share with others?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, of course, you can check out Stir List, right? There's some good ones there. I would say, so again, it just depends on what kind of recipes you're looking for. And as I said, we eat with our eyes, right?
Mhm,
So I
mhm.
tend to probably find more recipes on Instagram versus actually going directly to the recipe sites themselves, just because I'm very visual. So I like to scroll through my feed. I like to see what's coming across, and then I can direct them. So Food and Wine is one that I've seen some good dairy recipes. I actually have Chef Doreen in here with me right now. I'm in one of our labs. She's behind us. She's gonna-
Hello.
Doreen, where do you find recipes for dairy? Do you have any favorite recipe sites? We'll ask the chef.
Favorite recipes?
Yeah.
I have to say my textbooks first of all, because we know they're standardized.
She uses her textbooks because they're standardized. But I love her. Yeah. So you can see this is one of our labs actually here at school. So
That's awesome. Oh, what fun. What fun.
yeah, I know Eating Well magazine has some really great recipes for dairy. It has some online resources for dairy.
All recipes are
Yeah,
good. Food Network has a lot
Yes.
of those are good as well.
Absolutely.
Just looking for things in weights rather than measures would make it a lot more beneficial to you if you're going to be making it for larger amounts of people. So when you do your conversions, you don't have to worry about cups rather than
Ah.
with ounces
Yes.
and things like that.
Smart lady.
That makes sense.
I dragged her in here because I said I'm going to be doing this Q&A, so you might as well come in and listen.
Well, hey, the more the merrier, and I think that's terrific. And I definitely agree with you on weights as someone who bakes. Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Important.
That's right. That's right. Maybe a question for both of you too. Another question we have is, what advice do you have for someone who is lactose intolerant, but yet they love eating dairy products?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can tell you from the dietitian's perspective, and then maybe Chef can give us some thoughts too.
Absolutely.
Lactose-free milk, of course, is one option that you can utilize. We also, I just did this talk for the Nebraska Academy, so you can slice it, you can stir it, you can spoon it. So just small amounts, right, of incorporating dairy for someone who's lactose intolerant. Do you have any other
Well, that's what I was
ideas?
going to say is exactly what you just said.
Yeah, just smaller amounts. I mean, really, it's such an individual thing in terms of who can tolerate and what amount they can tolerate. So you have to experiment.
Another question for both of you then, since we have a chef as well, but what's maybe one of your favorite ways to eat dairy and consume dairy?
Well,
So
I
that could be a-
I think I shared mine. Well,
Mhm.
Well, my big thing right now is yogurt. And first thing in the morning, I love yogurt with a handful of almonds or my favorite nut. But right now it's almonds. And I always think I don't do things the same all the time, but clearly I have recently. And it keeps me very regular and makes me feel good. And I don't get hungry before my labs are up. So it's very important to not be grumpy during a lab.
I'm sure I was gonna say, I'm sure your students appreciate that. So
Yeah, I'm sure they do. Yes.
Absolutely. I love ice cream too, though. Not gonna lie, ice cream is.
Yeah, I'm a very big
Oh, yeah.
cheese lover. So any kind of cheese, any country.
And that was a different. Oh yeah, I think I might have mentioned this too with the hard cheeses.
Mhm.
Be a little lower in lactose, right?
Yes. Yep, absolutely. And I definitely agree with you. After working out, the ice cold chocolate milk, can't go wrong with that, and refuel that way. It's a great opportunity. And yeah, it doesn't get much better than that. But another question for you, Chef, just as we're talking about kind of, dairy and recipes, maybe what inspires you as a chef, especially if you're cooking with dairy ingredients?
Well, I hate to say it out loud, but cream, of course, sour cream, whipping cream, regular cream. It just adds so much flavor and mouthfeel to your products. And I know that you have to use moderation, but it is such a great product. When we're making sauces, we don't have to worry about curdling. It does add extra fat, but it adds so much flavor and so much more to your product. And you don't have to worry about it breaking. It's just something that you're better off to have an ounce of it than to have a whole cup of something else. So butter, I love my butter. I mean, it's very hard to do anything to substitute that. Just moderation again. There's just nothing like that mouthfeel or that flavor.
Absolutely. And Amber mentioned it earlier, you eat with your eyes, and kind of the old adage that fat is flavor. I remember that from a college course I took once upon a time, and I think that is so true. But definitely appreciate your insights and your support of dairy products in your cooking and in your classroom. And is that maybe something that you guys have seen more of a resurgence of, or kind of coming back to dairy in the past, in your recent history, or is kind of dairy always been a staple on the culinary side of things?
Well, we're all classically trained, so very French background. It's all cream and butter.
It's good stuff.
It really is. It's so classically trained chefs, that's what they're going to be using. You know, we try to steer off, but other countries, there's going to be more Mediterranean styles and using other types of fats, but that's really what our mainstay is that French culinary background.
Well, that's great to know, because I think that's something that we don't necessarily always see or even realize that is such a kind of a base level and such a fundamental foundation for culinary skills. Definitely appreciate that. And I'm not seeing any other questions, but I definitely appreciate your time today, Amber. And thanks for hopping in, Chef, to provide your insight as well. We appreciate it. But thank you so much for everything today. And I just want to remind attendees that there will be a quick survey that pops up. So please don't close your window. Make sure you take that. And we'll be back here next week at noon to meet with Don Schindler, where we'll talk about how we connect with our consumers. So with that, we'll sign off. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.